Well, wonderful. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another SAGE Applied Research webinar series. We're really excited for this one, which is another one co-sponsored with the Rural Sociological Society and their Sociology of Agriculture and Food Research Interest Group. We've been holding a couple of these. There was one last month with Florence Bicot, Ken Robinson at Conksha, from Clemson and Marshfield Research Clinic Institute. And then today we have the honor of Brady Heberlin to present on farm stress and the production of rural sacrifice zones. Brady is in the Department of Geography, the School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering at Indiana University at Bloomington. And I'm going to turn it over to her because y'all aren't here to hear me make an introduction, but instead to learn about the important topic that she will discuss today. So I'll turn it over to you, Brady.
Great. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I really appreciate you being here for this talk. And thank you to Andy and Emily and everyone at the Southern Ag Exchange Network and the Rural Sociological Society for having me. I'm really excited to connect with you all and share what I've been working on. And hopefully when we get to the Q&A, I can also hear how you're thinking about these things and so on. So as Andy said, my name is Brady Heberlin, and I'm a PhD student at Indiana University in both the Department of Geography and the School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering. I spent most of my childhood and my teenage years living in rural Indiana in a nearly 200-year-old farmhouse. Cornfields surrounded our yard on two sides, and my bus driver in middle school and high school was a farmer who lived across the cornfield from my childhood home. Rural farming communities, such as the one I grew up in, have a really special spot in my heart. So when I began to outline my master's thesis project in 2019, I saw one headline after another announcing high rates of suicide, depression, and addiction among farmers in a farm economy that is increasingly hostile towards small and medium-sized farms. Meanwhile, rural schools and hospitals and libraries across the country consolidated or else shuttered their doors completely, and local newspapers were bought out by these large media conglomerates and really reflected the interests not so much of the local community, but of stakeholders in those conglomerates. Most news and academic articles I read framed farm stress today as a mental health issue that could be solved with increased access to therapists or psychiatrists or with mindfulness techniques. I don't think those things are useless by any means, but what I try to get to in this talk is that those resources have some very serious limitations. And so this talk, Farm Stress and the Production of Rural Sacrifice Zones, is an attempt to think about farm stress spatially at the intersection of the economic and social relationships that sustain rural communities. But first, some of the headlines that prompted this research. Oops. In December of 2017, The Guardian asked us to consider, why are America's farmers killing themselves? In March of 2020, USA Today reported, Midwest farmers face a crisis, hundreds are dying by suicide. And just last month, the New York Times published a story about a farmer in Wisconsin who took his own life. The story was called Farmer's Death Spurs Fight Against Depression and Suicide. Suicide, depression, and other signals of farm stress are a persistent concern in farming communities today. In fact, the National Farmers Union found that farmers, ranchers, and agricultural managers had the highest rate of suicide by occupation in 2012. You can see here they ranked first by occupation, and then the third highest rate of suicide by occupation in 2015. And it's no secret that farmers and ranchers have hit hard times in the last 10 years or so, with bankruptcy filings particularly high in the Midwest. As you can see in this plot from the Farm Bureau, from 2011 to 2020, the cumulative number of Chapter 12 bankruptcy filings was especially high in South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Minnesota, parts of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan. That's 7 of the 12 states that compose the Midwest. Nebraska, the site of my research, had the 4th highest rate of Chapter 12 bankruptcy filings in the last 10 years or so. And by 2020, Nebraska had the 2nd highest rate of Chapter 12 bankruptcies in the nation. Bankruptcies are just the tip of the iceberg, as one person I spoke to at the Nebraska Farmers Union told me. Successfully filing a Chapter 12 bankruptcy means that you have a chance at reorganizing your farm or ranch's debt and staying in business. But bankruptcy rates, like suicide rates, woefully underestimate the extent of suffering in farming communities. To fully understand farm-related distress, we have to look at the impacts of an adverse farm economy on the social fabric of farming communities. In my own research, I wanted to look at whether high levels of distress correspond to economic restructuring and the collapse of rural social institutions that I've been reading about and seeing throughout rural communities in the US. I approached this project by looking at 3 sets of questions. My first question is quite simple. What are people in distress attributing their stress to? Or in other words, what are its causes? Second, what are the resources available to farmers in distress? How do they address this distress, and what assumptions do they make about farmers in distress? What assumptions do they make, and what are their limitations? Third, how does the mental health paradigm, that approach to farm stress that prescribes therapy, psychiatry, etc., restrict the possibilities for addressing farm stress? How can understanding farm stress in terms of rural sacrifice zones open more horizons for addressing it? Motivating all of that, of course, is really a question that has to do with power. What would it take to understand stress in rural communities in a way that allows us more possibilities for fostering the collective power and agency of people who live in those communities? Nebraska, the site of my research, is characterized by its rural landscape, which encompasses 99.3% of the state's land area. 26.9% of the people who live in Nebraska live in rural settings away from large cities. Farms and ranches make up 92% of Nebraska's total land area, which is a really astounding percentage of the state's land area, are farms and ranches. And as of 2019, the state of Nebraska ranked 3rd in the country, for its agricultural production by cash receipts, with the cow-calf sector making up almost half of the state's gross revenue in agriculture. At a farm stress training I attended in early 2020, just before the COVID pandemic hit the US, I met a longtime member of the Nebraska Rural Response Council. We discussed the persistent issue of farm stress in rural communities and ultimately entered into a collaborative research project to understand the data from their crisis hotline. So the Nebraska Rural Response Crisis Hotline is a farmer-oriented hotline serving Nebraska residents. It was founded in 1984 by a broad coalition of progressive organizations and ministries. Today, the hotline respondents are a small group of paid staff who have been supporting farmers for decades, some of them since the 1980s farm crisis. And the hotline takes between 250 to 650 calls a month from distressed farmers and residents of farming communities. Call respondents collect temporal, categorical, and spatial data for each call. So the hotline respondents are able to record data about each call while keeping names and other identifying details anonymous. Each call is categorized with only one category per call according to the content of the call. The hotline responder also records the caller's location by county, not their specific location, and the date of the call. So for this particular study, I was able to look at the data from July of 2015 to January to 2020, so about 4.5 years of calls to the crisis hotline. At first glance, the data suggests that the most common reason a caller reaches out to the hotline is due to a need to be heard, or in other words, the opportunity to share the troubles they're experiencing with another person. Tax and estate issues and direct counseling requests are also common reasons callers reach out to the hotline, and followed by financial counseling. As you can see, many of the categories which emerged directly from hotline responders' decades of experience taking calls from farmers are financial in nature. And given the Farm Bureau's findings a couple of years ago that financial issues were the most commonly noted source of distress among farmers and ranchers, I aggregated all financial issues together to see how many of the calls related to economic concerns, and again, these financial issues. Once aggregated, I found that financial concerns make up the most common call type, with a little under 4,500 calls from July 2015 to January 2020, compared to about 4,300 calls where callers expressed the need to be heard. And we'll get into in a second, whether those are really two different categories or not. I don't think they necessarily are. So 36.5% of calls explicitly concern financial distress before we consider including tax and estate issues, which span from questions of solvency to legal questions and estate planning. There we go. These tax and estate issues make up a large portion of the calls in their own right at 23.6% of all calls. And when asked why this call type was so common, a Nebraska Farmers Union member who was also on the Council for Nebraska Rural Response noted that many farmers realize they're not solvent during tax time. They can't. So, basically what I'm saying here is that, financial distress, tax and estate issues are a major concern for people who are calling the crisis hotline, but also that this other category, the need to be heard, isn't totally separate. It's really critical to note that according to multiple hotline responders, many calls get categorized as a need to be heard when the caller is embarrassed or shy about expressing financial concerns, or doesn't necessarily feel comfortable asking directly for financial resources or economic resources. And for anyone who's worked with farmers, that this is really connected to that kind of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, self-sufficiency, that kind of mindset that can lead to embarrassment asking for help or embarrassment asking for support. So it would be a conservative estimate to say that a little more than 1/3 of calls are related to financial distress. It's much likely a much higher rate of calls that are related to that. And a quarterly report from the Nebraska Rural Response Hotline from April 2019 echoes these findings that financial distress is really rampant among hotline callers. So that report says, financial distress remains the principal focus of work, the greatest demand, and the most challenging area in which to discover solutions. Cash flows are difficult. The hotline's quarterly reports also include the call frequency per county per month. So this map that you're seeing here, this is a map of Nebraska. I totaled the calls per county from July 2015 to January 2020 relative to the average census population during that period. And I checked the census population to make sure it wasn't erratic for each county so that I wasn't getting, really strange averages. And so then this map is the call frequency as a percent of the population, which accounts for the fact that cities like Lincoln or Omaha are going to have higher populations. So a certain number of calls there doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as the same number of calls in a more rural county. So when you're looking at this, if it's yellow, you're getting a high, if it's yellow or like yellow-green, you're getting a really high number of calls relative to the population size of that county. And as you can see, there's sort of this belt of counties in central Nebraska with high call volume relative to the county's population size. So if you're from Nebraska or you're familiar with Nebraska, you'll know this includes Arthur County, Blaine County, Brown County, Garfield County, Greeley County, Thomas County, and a few others. These counties are located in the Sandhills region of Nebraska, which is known for its sort of sandy and infertile soil, by and large, not completely, but that's a predominant feature of this region. And as a result, the farm economy in this area is made up almost exclusively of ranches in the cow-calf sector. And all but one of these counties are categorized by the USDA as farming dependent, which means 25% or more of its income or 16% or more of its employment is derived from farming. So when the data revealed this region that exhibited high levels of calls to a crisis hotline, which is a pretty good proxy for high levels of distress, I set out to find news stories, information on the Nebraska cow-calf sector, and some demographic statistics that could tell me a little bit more about the socioeconomic processes underway in this region. So why is there such a distinct belt of counties with high call volume to the Nebraska Rural Response Hotline? To begin to answer this question, I need to take a moment to describe the processes of economic restructuring underway in this area. It turned out that the counties with the highest call volume relative to their population size exhibit signs of two of the most frequent forms. It was saying let me turn my camera off. Let's see, stop video. All right. We were here. So it's the counties that have this really high call volume relative to their population size exhibit signs of two of the most frequent forms of economic restructuring in farming communities: land consolidation and industry consolidation. So let's think for a second about land consolidation to start. This region is characterized by the highest recent increases in land values in the state. So property values are going up. In the north region of the Sandhills, which overlaps with this region, grazing land values increased from 6% in 2019 to 2020, a 50% higher increase than surrounding regions. In the central part of the Sandhills, land values rose 4% in 1 year. This area is also characterized by high rates of tenant farming among farmers and ranchers, with 48% renting in the north and 58% in the central region. There have also been a decrease in the total number of farms and ranches in this area and an increase in the average size of the farm, a classic sign of land consolidation as farms get bigger, pushing out small and mid-sized farms. Taken together, these statistics give us a strong but not conclusory indication that land consolidation processes are underway in this region. The signal of industry consolidation in Nebraska's cow-calf sector, the predominant sector in this area, is even stronger. Nationally, 4 companies, JBS, Marfrig, Cargill, and Tyson, produce 73% of the nation's beef, a situation in which abuses and exploitation of ranchers is unfortunately likely. As beef packers consolidated over the last 30 years, there was a significant jump in the number of farms with over 500 heads. So we're seeing that says 50, it should be 500. So we're seeing these large sort of industrial ag style farms as small and mid-sized farms are being pushed out. Smaller operations between 10 to 200 cows decreased. In a Farm Bureau survey of Nebraska ranchers, addressing this market power was the overwhelming priority for producers. Like land consolidation, industry consolidation has a devastating effect on rural communities as it extracts value from those communities, usually concentrating it in the hands of these large international corporations. And so we're starting to see that once we begin to think about farmer distress spatially, really connecting those financial concerns to what's happening at a much larger scale, it becomes clear that it's a lot more than a mental health issue, or that it can't necessarily be addressed with the classic mental health resources we might think of. And in his 2019 paper, Hollowed Out Heartland, Mark Edelman argues that economic restructuring via corporate and financial extraction of value and resources from rural communities produces what he calls rural sacrifice zones. He uses the term rural sacrifice zone to describe the cascading effects that economic restructuring in the farm economy has on the social fabric of rural communities, linking what happens on farmland across the country to widespread distress and into the entire rural economies and social institutions. Edelman's notion of the rural sacrifice zone draws on a much larger body of literature on sacrifice zones across the world, including sites of corporate extraction such as mines, nuclear power plants, mega basins, and highways that cut through communities. In a paper published in 2018, Reinhardt noted that sacrifice zones are produced through a bundle of techniques and devices by which the exercise of destructive violence can be erased, trivialized, naturalized, justified, and rendered as innocuous or necessary. The ways in which a rural sacrifice zone is produced can vary spatially, though they frequently exhibit some combination of land consolidation, industry consolidation, extraction of value or resources, and large infrastructure projects such as energy plants, transportation infrastructure, or prisons. In the case of specifically rural sacrifice zones, Edelman notes that empty storefronts and malls, vanished newspapers, and ubiquitous dollar outlets are not just signs of job loss and economic precarity. Inhabitants of sacrifice zones read them as stark, painful reminders of abandonment and a shredded social fabric. For Edelman and in my research here, the production of rural sacrifice zones occurs as capital consolidates. Land consolidation and industry consolidation frequently drive depopulation, and the counties I identified as a crisis belt in Nebraska have not been spared that effect. From 2000 to 2008, for example, 2 counties in the crisis belt, Blaine County and Thomas County, saw especially alarming rates of depopulation. Thomas County's population dropped by 20%, and Blaine County's dropped by 27%. Schools and other social institutions in these 2 counties were forced to consolidate their sports teams amidst depopulation. In Primrose, one of the cities in this region, the town school was abandoned entirely. Nearly every other county in this region also experienced notable depopulation from 2015 to 2020, the time period of interest in this study. As farming communities such as these face land consolidation and industry consolidation, fewer people farm fewer and larger farms. There are fewer jobs in local processing facilities, populations dwindle, the tax base for schools, libraries, and other social institutions wanes, and they are forced to close or consolidate. So farm stress is not happening in a vacuum or in the individual minds or lives of farmers and residents of farming communities alone. It is an unfortunately predictable and perhaps reasonable response to the collapse of entire communities under pressure. And now that we've situated farm stress, both in the case of high call volume in particular counties in Nebraska, and in terms of a general trend toward the production of rural sacrifice zones with these pressures of land and industry consolidation in this particular case, and in other cases, these large sort of like mega projects that extract resources. I want to turn to the resources available to farmers in distress and ask my final question. Is there a gap between the underlying causes of distress among farmers and ranchers and the resources available to them? It's true that the ongoing farm crisis has not been without a response from extension agencies, universities, and farming organizations. To date, there are dozens of programs initiated to contend with the distress facing farmers and ranchers, as well as residents of farming communities. The Michigan State Rural Resilience course teaches farmers to recognize stress and anxiety in each other and direct their peers toward mental health resources, among other resources that it offers. In the Farm Bureau's farm stress training, they encourage participants to know the warning signs of farm stress, such as ways individuals might appear disheveled, disinterested, or accident-prone in farming or in their everyday lives. The Ohio State Extension Agency encourages farmers and ranchers to adopt stress coping techniques, such as deep breathing and meditating. These can be great tools for farmers and ranchers. They can even prevent a suicide. They can intervene in substance use, and so on. They also, however, pathologize and attempt to heal farm stress as individual disorders, rather than the operations of corporations, the financial sector, we could say capitalism writ large. Resources that adopt this mental health paradigm can face huge limitations. They functionally ask farmers and ranchers, indirectly, implicitly, to manage their stress. Just like the rise of industrialized farming corresponded to extension agents and agricultural economists teaching farmers to manage their farm. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the limitations of this approach. The mental health approach to farm stress obscures the roles of corporations, investors, and elected officials in the production of rural sacrifice zones. And it can functionally affirm farmers' self-perceptions and expectations of themselves and their farm for self-sufficiency. This can be really dangerous. It can hold them individually responsible for the cascading effects of corporate and financial extraction that they are not actually responsible for. And so it can substitute individualized therapy and economic decisions for collective agency and mobilization that draws on shared experiences in rural America and in farming communities. And it can reinforce a kind of nostalgia for a return to types of prospering rural communities that are frankly unlikely to occur from our current economic and historical moment. I don't know that we, will return to this vision of the, historical successful moments of farming. And the second point is, I'm not sure we necessarily want to, or that we should encourage that, because that vision relies on the ongoing dispossession of people of color, a relationship to land that, is sort of fundamentally connected to whiteness and to colonization. And I think there really are other ways that we can address farm stress as this systemic and structural issue. As Bryant and Garnham put it in 2013, the mental health paradigm of farm stress limits and excludes other possible renderings of farmer suicide and thus narrows the frame of appropriate response. So when we see farm bureaus claim that you can't avoid farm stress, but you can manage it, that's a quote from them, we have to ask, is that really true? Is that the only option for farmers and ranchers faced with the collapse of their farms and communities, to manage the collapse through mindfulness or their individual economic decisions? What if, rather than respond to distress by individualizing it, by accepting that you can only get therapy and make better economic decisions within the collapse of these rural communities, we treated it as a shared experience that is inherently political in nature? As I start to wrap up, I want to summarize the findings, which are also in our my paper with Annie Shattuck in the Journal of Rural Studies. I would also like to take a moment to expand on the paper a little bit and share a few thoughts that we don't get into in the paper itself. So as a summary of the findings and what this paper is really about, if you get a chance to read it. So first, we know that Nebraska farmers are facing economic distress, and that economic distress is the most common cause of distress among people who call the hotline. That goes a long way toward telling us that deep breathing, meditation, some of these psychological resources and individual, economic counseling can't really address the root causes of farm-related distress. Second, most of the resources available to farmers in distress do not address these root causes. They're addressing the problem, or they're sort of operating at the wrong scale. Third, our geospatial and archival analyses of the crisis belt in the Nebraska Sandhills supports explaining farm stress in terms of the production of rural sacrifice zones. Framing farm stress as a cascading effect of the production of rural sacrifice zones allows us to approach it as a systemic issue, expanding the possibility for addressing it. It allows us to connect stress and suicide among farmers to things like depopulation, consolidation, the closure of schools, libraries, and other centers of social life, and to the general isolation facing farmers and ranchers today. It also loosens the constraints of the mental health paradigm, allowing us to approach this issue as a systemic issue, expanding again the possibilities for addressing it. So I've shown that farm stress in Nebraska, and likely much more broadly, is connected to the corporate and financial extraction of value from farming communities. But I could never put it as well as one interviewee from the Nebraska Farmers Union did. When I asked him, why did the Sandhills rancher he was telling me about take his own life? He told me, it happens because these guys can't see the system. Thank you. Again, my name is Brady Heberlin. I'm really glad to be here today. Do feel free to contact me. My email is right here. I enjoy giving talks virtually or meeting with people over Zoom to discuss this kind of research. And the QR code here will take you to the paper about the paper that we did about this, which has most of the information that I covered here today. All right.
Well, Brady, thank you so much for that enlightening talk on your research. I think it provides a really crucial way of framing farm stress and allows us to understand different data points as well, of thinking about hotline data specifically as a way to proxy distress in a given region. And then your really brilliant way of connecting that also to the fraying of rural communities that has been an ongoing historical process within the United States. We do have some questions in the chat. I also have my own question, but I think I won't use my my power over the mic to go first. And instead, I would like to start with Maureen's question, which is, she notes she works for Penn State Cooperative Extension on the Family Wellbeing Unit and is involved on their farm stress team. And she would like to know, what kinds of initiatives or efforts would you like to see systems like ours do to move beyond individual and or family level interventions?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, first of all, I think the possibilities are really, really endless. And sort of like every thing that gets affected by everything that contributes to the making of a rural sacrifice zone is a possible point of intervention, from housing to the ability of farmers themselves to receive health care, et cetera. These are all, kind of like critical ways or critical points of intervention or of support. I'm very partial to models of support that put infrastructure and resources in the hands of the people that need them and that are affected by them. And so things like, things like if there's an issue with housing, like, can we think about cooperative housing or land trust options, or things that stabilize housing and put that in the hands of the people that are affected by it. Or similar with if there are these huge barriers to small and mid-sized farmers having access to the technology they need, et cetera, to make their farm successful, is there a way to sort of pool those resources in a cooperative way where it's not an outside nonprofit or yeah. So just to wrap up answering that question, I think one of the things that could be really just really make positive change in rural communities is thinking about ways that those communities can have access to the infrastructure they need, to the spaces of social life, to the tools they need for farming, in a way that reduces their dependencies on loans and potentially predatory loans on these corporations that don't really allow them full access to their John Deere tractors or whatever that they can't actually fix when they break down. Reducing those dependencies through cooperative efforts, I think, would be what I would suggest. But I think there are so many possibilities once we think of it this way.
Thank you very much, Brave, for that response. The next question is from Eric's Dunans, and they ask, do you see current action or a potential for involvement of national level farm policy organizations like Farmers Union or Farm Bureau involved in responding to the systems and structures leading to farm stress?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know I've worked more directly with the Farmers Union, and I know this is something they are thinking about and working on quite a bit. And Farm Bureau, they have published some really great analyses of farm stress, and obviously have this at least one farm stress training that I know about. I do think, we start to get into complex territory when we think about policy around farm stress. I think it's really good when people are pushing for more funding for resources, et cetera. But it's also, it's no secret that a lot of elected officials have really close ties with some of the corporations or CEOs that are hollowing out rural communities like this. And so if the policy front is the only front people are fighting on, if there isn't self-organization, sort of like kind of like mass mobilization, then we get stuck at the limits of, where elected officials might just not be representing people's interests because they're, they have these ties, these like financial, economic, and social ties to some of the corporations and hedge funds and pension funds who are doing a lot of harm in rural communities. So I think it's kind of a yes and answer. They're doing great work to push on farm stress, but there also needs to be this kind of self-organization that's not beholden to necessarily like directly to policymakers.
I think that that's an excellent point. And I think it also dovetails into a conversation that's in the chat, where Michael Schulman, who's actually my wonderful mentor at North Carolina State University, is bringing up the literature around individual versus system blame perspectives. And Brady, I believe part of that literature you were bringing up when you cited Bryant and Graham. I was wondering if you could unpack Bryant and Graham's arguments a bit more for the audience.
Oh, that's a great question. So to be honest, it's been about 2 years since I've read their paper, and my recall is not super, super sharp. But I know they are really working on this sort of idea of the moral economy is like one issue that they take up, and this interconnectedness of the everyday decisions and affect or feeling that farmers experience while farming, and this larger sort of big system, big picture, I could not get the right word, big picture systemic network of values and of interactions with other people. So they're really trying to push for this sort of like social fabric, approach to farm stress, which is something I obviously draw on and I find very inspirational.
I guess building on that, and this comes to the question that I was kind of having, is thinking about this need to be heard and this financial distress component, and the rural sacrifice zone kind of being a fraying of the social community. Is there kind of like a mutualism that could be supportive or provide a financial safety net to farmers that kind of leverages collective agency? And is that what you were kind of alluding to when talking about getting beyond specifically policy-oriented solutions?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Like, and what exactly that, like interdependency or mutualism is another good word for it. What exactly that could look like, I think, is so specific to a particular region and like existing relationships, etc. I think, let me try to think of a good example. If I've got one off the top of my head. I mean, I think part of the issue there becomes like kind of like the movement of people like through rural spaces, like we talk a lot about these kind of like urban rural divides, et cetera. And it's, rural living can be really like isolating. And there's ways in which, urban organizations, more kind of like urban projects and movements can connect with rural groups and communities and also like support them, whether it's through I'm having trouble coming up with exact examples, but I think the answer is like roughly, I think there is like a really strong potential for these kind of like mutualistic or interdependent relationships being another option in addition to pushing for policy and for funding for more resources.
Thank you. There is one last question in the chat, and then I think we'll kind of move towards a close for today. And this question's from Julie. They're asking, I was wondering about the concept that you highlighted of farmers, ranchers being inhibited in talking about financial concerns. One of the things that a lot of people in the ag mental health space talk about is how this population is less inclined to talk about mental behavioral health concerns. Is there any data you can point to that help us identify what farmers and or ranchers feel okay to talk about to gain entry into these more difficult conversations?
Oh, that is a very, very good question. You know, in some sense, that is like a methodological question, right? It's like how do you approach this topic sort of orthogonally, like not head on. I don't know of any papers off the top of my head that are like, you know, really dig into the methods of those conversations. I would love, love, love to see one written. I think the closest things I've seen are really these papers that talk in a generous and historical and understanding way about the construction of, you know, like masculinity in rural America, of whiteness in rural America, and of this kind of like individual autonomy. And I think if you approach people, you know, not in a sort of like I'm canceling you because you didn't demonstrate masculinity. Like a lot of people in my generation, you know, will approach rural people who they read as conservative, et cetera. But if you approach people really understanding like how those things are constructed, then it's like that's my experience with like being able to be like, oh, like that hurts you too, doesn't it? Like that like affects you in a negative way. And like, and I don't know, maybe there's a methods paper to be written in that. Maybe there's a paper about how to have these kind of like sensitive, hard conversations in a really caring way.
Well, and Brady, would you mind if I added just a piece to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, in terms of like our experiences and some of the data we've collected, other strategies that can also approach this are one, folding farm stress discussions into existing programs. So like if you're going to have like our colleagues at NC Choices had a conference on marketing niche meat, and we were able to set up a table at that conference and provide information on programming around mental health and farm stress to farmers directly without making it the centerpiece. And so that meant that farmers that did want to have a conversation with us could have that conversation, and other farmers that didn't want to talk directly about it but wanted information could just like move on by, grab the information, hear the conversation going on, and then continue about their day. And I think that that is another way that we can indirectly move into those conversations, because it is something that still carries stigma, and not just in farming communities, right? Like in the general population. So that could be another strategy for those that are in kind of more formal institutions like Extension, et cetera, to kind of bring farm stress discussions into places where farmers will be, to access other information and resources.
Yeah, I think that's a really great answer. It's funny, you know, my answer was kind of like the 30,000 foot view answer, which my advisor is always telling me I need to, you know, I can get, my head can be sort of like, you know, thinking theory first and then the, you know, the on the ground reality. But I think yeah, often what you're saying with kind of starting from the immediate concern and then situating it like more broadly and finding like, you know, careful ways to be like this, you're not the only one concerned about this, you know, this is not you, like this is much bigger, you know. It's definitely that very rooted, you know, approach.
Well, I want to say, again, just really appreciate you providing us with this time, and obviously on a topic that's incredibly important. In the Q&A, there is now a really good discussion of folks sharing out different ways of broaching this topic of farm stress. Lori mentions incorporating behavioral health as one component of overall producer wellness. Jake is noting that there is a suggested training on conversational skills for difficult conversations with farmers and those in farming communities, confident conversations, a training offered in June presented by the University of Delaware. And just as a response to the question around the slides and recording, well, the recording specifically will be up on the SAGE website when that goes live, which we are currently getting together. When it is live, I'm going to make sure to share that link out to everyone that has registered for this webinar. And then you will also be able to access the video library of prior webinars and future webinars as well. And there does seem to be one last question that seems like a methods question, Brady, that you might want to answer. And that is, how did the Rural Response Hotline incorporate this research into their work with farmers who contacted them? Or a programming question, really.
Yeah, totally. So I wasn't in direct communication with the farmers other than the people who overlapped, who were both farmers and part of the Nebraska Rural Response Council, or who were both farmers and part of the Nebraska Farmers Union. And that really had to do with the fact that I am not trained to engage with people in crisis. I've had one farm stress training, but I do not have the skills to handle that directly. But I was working with them through the data and the data that they had, which was anonymized, and through the interviews that I did with people on the Nebraska Rural Response Council and the Nebraska Farmers Union. And once I had a preliminary data visualization and my interpretation, I would exchange a few emails with Nebraska Rural Response and be like, here's a data visualization, a plot or a graph. Here's what I'm reading into this, but you are the expert. Like, what do you see when you look at this? And we'd go back and forth a little bit. And then about a year after the project started, and once COVID
Well, it appears Brady froze. Poor Brady's internet connection. And I'll close this out here. I would like to thank everybody for attending. I will make sure to send out Brady's article with Annie Shattuck on rural sacrifice zones to the registrants, so that you can read her work, which I think is vital in these times. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and look out for future SAGE applied research webinars. We will be having a moderated discussion in June with Mary Hendrickson, Dr. Heather Sedges, and Jack Whippler from Farsan Northeast. And that is going to be another very informative presentation. So look out for that to register, and I see y'all in the future.